Okay.
Can you all see my screen nicely? It should be just the calorie slide.
Yes, we can.
Okay, I think we can go on and start. Okay, hi, welcome everybody to the Behavioral Aspect of Sustained Calorie Restriction in Humans webinar. My name is Giovanna Zappalà and I am a Program Officer at the National Institute on Aging. This webinar is part of the CALERIE Research Network efforts to disseminate information and make investigators aware of the availability for research exploitation of the CALERIE databases and biospecimens. Now, you will learn more about those resources through the webinar that will be led by Corby Martin. Let me introduce Corby. He is a professor at Pennington Biomedical Research Center. He is the director of the Phenotyping Core in the Nutrition Obesity Research Center, and he also directs the Ingestive Behavior, Weight Management, and Health Promotion Laboratory. He's a clinical researcher with deep expertise in the study of energy balance, including interventions to modify the diet, exercise, and body weight. He also works at the development and evaluation of weight management interventions that are delivered remotely via smartphones. And actually, he has developed and validated the methods to measure food intake based on images of food which is captured with the smartphone app. Dr. Martin is one of the CALERIE investigators, and he has been involved, in fact, with CALERIE since 2002. So, Corby, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Giovanna, for the nice introduction. Again, I'm Corby, and I'm down here in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where Pennington Biomedical Research Center is located. We're part of the Louisiana State University system. Before I start the webinar, I do just want to note for the attendees that the CALERIE project included a very large team of individuals from NIH, specifically NIA, as well as Duke, Tufts, WashU, and Pennington. So I'd like to thank the broader CALERIE team and acknowledge them. Also, there is the CALERIE Research Network that you'll hear briefly about at the end of this webinar, and they really provided the infrastructure to get the CALERIE computer tracking system data to you, and to also provide the resources for this webinar to happen. And finally, we of course want to recognize the sponsors of CALERIE. CALERIE was supported by a series of UO1 or cooperative agreement grants from the NIA with additional funding from the BDK, and we're very thankful to the funding sources. Okay, so and one other thing I'll mention is that I borrowed a lot of CALERIE slides from Bill Krause and other members of the CALERIE team, so I thank Bill, Kim, and others from Duke for loaning me their slides. All right, here we have a brief overview of the webinar today. First and foremost, we're going to review the CALERIE projects, especially phase 2, so you can really understand what exactly was tested during CALERIE phase 2 and what data are available to you. So this will include a review of the design of the study, as well as a very brief and terse review of the results. We will again also mention the CALERIE Research Network, as well as the CALERIE website, which is critical for you to know about, assuming that you want to obtain computer tracking system data. And the CTS is really why we're here today, so I will review what data are available in the CTS. We'll also note a few FOAs that are available that will rely on CTS data. And we'll provide some examples of the data and really try to articulate to you really the breadth and amount of process data that we have from the CALERIE computer tracking system.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's briefly review CALERIE and why CALERIE restriction matters and why it's of interest to study in humans. So the interest in specifically calorie restriction in humans, was really spurred in large part by the Biosphere 2 project, where a number of scientists, I believe there were 6 or 8 scientists, spent time in the biosphere, which is a self-contained bubble, so to speak, out in the desert. And it was designed to really see if they could produce their own food and ultimately live on colonies in unhospitable environments like outer space, the moon, or what have you. And unfortunately, they couldn't produce enough food. So they achieved about a 750 calorie per day deficit diet. And they lost about 15% of their body weight while they were in the Biosphere 2. So they were pretty extensively studied. And what they found is that the Biospherians had obviously weight loss, like we just mentioned, but they also had beneficial physiological, hematological, biochemical, and metabolic alterations that were consistent with the calorie restriction literature from rodents and primates. So for those of us that want to live a long, healthy life, there's only a couple of ways in which we can extend our lifespan, or at least in which it's believed that we can extend our lifespan. And if you were to look at the animal literature, that would be cold exposure and also calorie restriction. So what we see with calorie restriction here from the Biosphere 2 participants is that their metabolism slowed about 6%, and this is adjusted metabolism. So as we lose weight, we of course have a decrease in metabolism or energy expenditure. Because we have less body mass to keep alive and to carry around. However, if you adjust energy expenditure for changes in body mass, you get this adjusted energy expenditure value. And if that is negative, it means that we are burning less calories than we should given our body mass. And so we're basically seeing metabolic adaptation in the people that were in the Biosphere 2, which again is really one of the hallmark features of the calorie restriction literature from animals. And it's believed that this reduction in metabolic rate ultimately slows the rate of aging, which is one of the main theories of aging. So the way in which we believe that calorie restriction could perhaps improve longevity is through reduced reactive oxygen species production, which reduces oxidative stress, oxidative damage, or through lowering the metabolic rate. And as this finding, I'm not going to go into it in much detail, but it really shows you kind of how these theories of aging work and how calorie restriction can affect physiology and biology to improve our lifespan and hopefully also our health span, or the length of which okay, so now let's get into the nitty-gritty about the CALERIE project. So the CALERIE project started a long time ago, in the early 2000s, and the first phase of CALERIE, or CALERIE Phase 1, included 3 separate pilot projects that were conducted in Pennington, as well as Tufts and WashU. And I saw, Kim, you just raised your hand. Do you have a question?
Yes, Corby, would you mind asking everybody to put your mute button on?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Much better. So the CALERIE Phase 1 project, again, we had 3 pilot studies conducted at 3 separate locations. And what we're showing here are results from the CALERIE Phase 1 project at Pennington Biomedical here in Baton Rouge. And during this 6-month RCT, we randomized overweight individuals to a healthy diet, but energy requirement or energy balance control condition. They're here in the diamond-shaped items. And then we also had a calorie restriction group, which is this group here, the closed squares. And this calorie restriction group was prescribed 25% CR. So they had a 25% energy deficit diet, and that was achieved solely through calorie restriction. Now, here are the triangles. These individuals were assigned to a CR exercise condition, or CREX, and they were prescribed a 12.5% energy restricted diet in addition to an increase in energy expenditure of 12.5%, So that produces a total energy deficit of 25%, which matches the other group that was following 25% CR by diet alone. Now, in this study, we also had a low-calorie diet, which is noted here in the open squares. This group followed a meal replacement diet. It consisted of 890 kcals per day. And they followed that diet until they lost 14 or 15% of their weight. And then we tried to clamp their weight thereafter and put them back on whole food for the rest of the trial. And what you can see from this pilot study here at Pennington is that the participants in the LCD, they lost about 14% of their body weight. The 25% CR and the combined CR and exercise group, they lost right around 10% with not much change in the control. And critically in this project, we did see a signal for metabolic adaptation. So we did have significantly reduced metabolic rate at both month 3 and month 6 in the calorie restricted groups. And this decrease in metabolism was much larger, shouldn't say much larger, it was significantly larger than what you'd expect based on body mass. So the way that we do this is we have, here we have sleeping energy expenditure on this axis, and then we have the regression equation that is built from baseline values to predict what energy expenditure should be at follow-up based on measured body mass. And so when you see the actual or measured energy expenditure values falling below this regression line, you're seeing metabolic adaptation. That is a reduction in metabolic rate that is greater than what you'd expect based on the change in body mass alone. And so here you can see the calorie values. So at month 3, we predicted that energy metabolism should be basically 1,600 calories, but it was closer to 1,475. And here you see the data for month 6 as well. Point being, we're getting about a 6% metabolic adaptation, which is similar to the Biospherians, the data here that I showed you earlier. So again, we're getting a signal that we are seeing metabolic adaptation with calorie restriction in overweight individuals. And therefore, the question during calorie phase 2 was to determine whether or not 25% CR resulted in sustained metabolic adaptation over 2 years. So we were looking for a reduction in core body temperature and reduced resting metabolic rate adjusted for changes in body composition. And we tested this over 2 years. So this is a pretty heavy lift clinically. Now, the secondary aims included a whole host of safety measures, and we also included a number of exploratory aims. So we really tried to include a very large swath of assessments to try to assess other endpoints that are relevant to aging research and aging questions, also cardiometabolic questions and other health-related questions. So here's a brief list of them here. But again, I will show you the CALERIE website later on, and you can actually go download the protocol and all of the endpoints that we collected from the website. Now, calorie phase 2, unlike phase 1, where we had 3 separate studies across 3 sites, here we had a multi-center parallel group RCT where all 3 sites followed the same protocol. So the 3 clinical sites were Pennington down here in Baton Rouge. We also had a site at WashU in St. Louis, also at Tufts University. Again, we worked very closely with our colleagues at NIH, specifically the NIA and NIDDK, and Duke DCRI was actually the coordinating center, and so they coordinated the entire project. Now, importantly, the calorie data set is quite unique because we're producing or trying to produce 25% CR in the sample. Of course, there is also an ad lib control group, but we're trying to do this in individuals who are fairly lean, at least in terms of the CR or weight loss literature. So the BMI range was 22 to 28 for enrollment. Here's the age range for men, and here's the age range for women. And we had 218 participants who started the intervention, and we finished 188. And we'll show you here on the next 2 slides some details from two different views of the consort diagram. So what's critical to note here is that we actually had 143 participants start the CR intervention, and we had 117 finish. Over here for the ad lib or weight maintenance healthy diet group, we had 75 start and 71 finish. And here you can see the reason why people dropped out. And here's a more simplified version of the consort diagram. You can see that with our 188 completers, we basically had about 14% dropout. That was obviously higher in the intervention versus the ad lib group. But this is really quite good for a 2-year, very intensive, really burdensome project. So we're really quite happy with that dropout rate. Okay, here on this slide, I'm showing you the demographics of the CALERIE phase 2 subjects. So we randomized to the CR versus ad lib in a 2-to-1 ratio. So we have 143 again in CR and 75 in ad lib, about 75% white, predominantly female. And here you can see the age, weight, BMI, and other metrics broken down by group and specifically by sex within group. And the one thing that I really want us to pay attention to is, number one, this sample was really not unhealthy. In fact, they were actually healthy by default, right? So you can see that their average BMI was about 25.1 for the entire study. Their average age was right around 38 or so. And what you can see from their health parameters here, for example, blood pressure, glucose, insulin, HDL, LDL triglycerides, this sample was really fairly healthy. So this is unlike a sample that you might see from a typical weight loss study where the mean BMI might be 35 or 38, and you're seeing higher blood pressures, insulin insensitivity, and so forth. Okay, let's briefly review the assessment paradigm. So again, we did a lot of assessments with these folks. So we had a series of metabolic and behavioral outcomes that were quantified in the CR group, basically every 6 months, month 6, 12, 18, and 24. The assessments occurred a little less frequently in the AL group or ad lib group, that's the control group, at month 12 and 24. We had a pretty intensive inpatient stay, so we could assess 24-hour core body temperature. We performed OGTTs, did our metabolism testing, and so forth, also muscle and fat biopsies. Also, there were a number of ancillary studies associated with this project. So as an example, we also put subjects in the metabolic chamber here at Pennington as part of an ancillary project. So rest assured that you have very good data across the 2 years. It's really quite complete and replete, and it's a very, very good data source. And I've been involved in a number of trials, and I got to say that our data collection paradigms were really quite good across the 3 sites, and we have really good data from the project. So you probably already figured this out, but we recruited participants here at baseline. Here's the demos or the entry criteria that we just reviewed. We're randomizing in a 2-to-1 ratio to 2 years of 25% calorie restriction, or 2 years of an ad lib, basically weight maintenance diet. And the 3 clinical sites were, again, Tufts, Pennington, and WashU. All right, what did we find? So here we have just the high-level results from the study. We've already published a lot of papers publishing the results. And so here I'm going to show you just a snapshot of the main results from the primary paper. And I forgot to cite it here as Eric Ravison from, I think, 2015. So first, what you can see is that in terms of percent CR, as is typical in these projects, we obtain better CR early on in the intervention as compared to late. So by month 24, CR was down to about 12% or so. And here you can see the average reduction in kcals across the time points from baseline to month 12 and baseline to month 24 in the CR group, and then we have change in energy intake levels in the AL group as well. So again, you all will remember that we were targeting 25% CR, and we actually achieved right around 11.5 or 12%. that could be viewed as a failure, but I was a member of the intervention team, and rest assured, like you'll see here in a minute, that the way in which we tried to foster adherence to 25% CR among the CR participants actually indicates that we were more adherent than you might guess from this image. And you'll see this again in a graph here in a few slides, but basically, if we were achieving right around 15% CR or so, many of the participants were actually considered adherent based on the approach that we used to define adherence for the participants. So more on that in a minute. Now here you can see the weight loss data. So we have the ad-lib control group, again here with the closed circles. Open circles are the CR group. And we're basically producing about 10% weight loss over the 2 years. And importantly, we actually saw really good weight loss continue through month 12, out to month 14 or 15 for many of the participants. So we did drive really good, long, sustained CR. And you're not seeing too much of an uptick here. So most of us know that in many of our studies, specifically our typical weight loss studies with overweight and obese individuals, we see a checkmark pattern where we have the maximum amount of weight loss that we're going to get by month 6. And then it goes up, over 2 to 4 years, right almost to baseline. So we didn't see that here. We have pretty good sustained CR. So we obviously had a pretty decent period which the participants were weight suppressed, but generally in roughly weight maintenance, if not a slight positive energy balance because of the uptick in weight there. Okay, so what did we find for the main outcome? So change in core body temperature didn't change much, or it didn't differentially change much by group. So there's a reduction here in the CR group, but the decrease in core body temperature didn't differ by group. And here you have the p-values for differences of month 12 and 24. So again, these are differences where we're looking at the AL or control group versus CR on change in the outcome variables. Now here we have the RMR data for 12 months. So you'll remember that one of the main primary outcomes was metabolic rate. And we wanted to see whether or not metabolism, RMR in this case, decreased greater than what you'd expect based on changes in body comp. So it's this adjusted RMR or adjusted energy expenditure. And as you can see here, when we lose weight, our RMR, of course, decreases as it did here in the CR group, which are the open bars, versus the ad-lib control group, which are the closed bars. And you'd, of course, expect that because you're losing weight and your metabolism goes down because you have less body mass. So here is a graph similar to the one that I showed you earlier, where we have the RMR residual or the adjusted RMR values. And so what we're seeing here is that when you normalize the data at follow-up for change in body mass, we're actually seeing reduced metabolic rate in the CR group that is greater than what you'd expect as compared to the ad-lib control group. So this is 12 months data. So again, this is after 1 year of CR. And we did get significance where we saw a greater reduction in adjusted metabolic rate in the CR versus the ad-lib control group. However, at month 12, we continue to see the unadjusted decrease in the CR group, but the adjusted values are less strong, and so we actually didn't get significance here at 2 years or month 24. Now, again, there's a number of papers that are published, and we'll show you where those are published on the CALERIE website here in a minute. But here are some data from the Change in the Metabolic Syndrome Score paper. And what you can see is that when you look at cardiometabolic health, specifically metabolic syndrome score here, you do, of course, see that go down to a greater extent in the calorie restriction group versus the ad-lib control group. So rest assured that many of the changes that you would expect to see on health parameters such as blood pressure, triglyceride levels, and so forth, generally you saw those going down in the CR group as you'd expect versus AL. But remember, this was a pretty healthy group at baseline. So I myself, I can't speak for all the investigators, but I myself was actually impressed to see some of these changes, given that most of the baseline values were well within normal limits. Now, relevant to the discussion today, especially the CTS data that we'll talk about here shortly, we also assessed a number of psych and behavioral outcomes. And this was important because we were trying to foster really pretty significant calorie restriction, about 25%, in individuals that had a starting BMI of like 22. And that could be perceived by many investigators as a bit dangerous, because back in the 80s and early 90s, we believe that dieting, especially among individuals who are already lean, could really cause things like eating disorders or binge eating or anorexia or bulimia nervosa. So we were really keen to, number one, screen individuals and exclude them if they had an eating disorder, but also to evaluate eating disorder symptoms and other psych and behavioral constructs such as depression, quality of life, mood, and things of that nature, also stress levels, and really see whether or not we were negatively affecting quality of life, because we reduced BMI significantly, and in fact, our lower safety criteria was a BMI of 18.5, and we did indeed have participants that approached that 18.5 mark, and we actually would then, of course, terminate the CR intervention and put them more on a weight maintenance diet plan. Either way, we didn't see any effect on eating disorder symptomatology. We had no negative effect on quality of life. I published a paper in 2016 that actually showed that CR had some favorable, kind of mild to moderate effect size effects on mood and quality of life as compared to the ad-lib group. They're listed here. And again, just like other parameters, this result to me was really quite interesting because, for example, the mood scores from the BDI or Beck Depression Inventory 2, you know, they started off really low because this was a pretty healthy sample, but we did see some improvement in the CR versus ad-lib or control group, even though they started off really quite healthy. Same thing with quality of life. This was a really healthy sample and they had really high quality of life, but we still saw some improvement in at least one or two measures from the SF-36. Okay, so from phase 2, we found that 25% CR over 2 years is not necessarily feasible in the sense that we achieved only about 12 or 14% CR over that 2-year period. Again, I think that we still drove really good CR over that 2-year period, and we approximated our target. And we did see evidence for CR to induce metabolic adaptation, but we lost that effect. That was at 12 months, but we lost that effect by month 24. And we also didn't see any, untoward effects on mood or quality of life. And there's also other safety papers and things like bone papers that we've also published that are out in the literature. Okay, we want to acknowledge all the people that were involved in CALERIE phase 2. This doesn't do it justice. There were very large teams at NIA, NIDDK, the 3 clinical sites, and DCRI that really made this study happen. But here are some of the main players, and the PIs of each site are noted in bold text. Okay, now that we know about CALERIE phase 2, let's talk about the CTS, or the computer tracking system. And I want to refer everyone to the CALERIE website. If you copy this website here, just copy this, drop it into your browser, and it will populate or take you to the CALERIE website. It is a critical resource for you. It includes all of the protocols, an outline of what data we have available that is free for download right now, and also other biospecimens that could be available to you upon request and after they're reviewed by a committee. Also, the website, if you can't get answers from the website, there is an email address where you can email specific questions to the CALERIE team at Duke, and they will do a very good job of answering them. And Manju, Kim, and others do a lot of hard work to keep all this up live and updated, so we thank them for their efforts. Okay, so if you go to the CALERIE website, there's actually a list of publications. And there's a lot of them there, but if you want to learn about the CTS, or computer tracking system, pull this paper by Amy Rickman. It really describes the intervention and really does a good job at articulating how we utilize the CTS, how we created it, and really what we wanted to use it for. So I'm going to pull some main points from that paper here and give you, again, just about the 10 or 15,000 foot overview. So the computer tracking system was an online system and tool to really facilitate intervention delivery across the 3 clinical sites. And it was critical because it helped us systematically personalize the treatment across subjects and sites. So because we utilize the CTS and this algorithmic approach, we're pretty confident that if one of my participants here in Baton Rouge was non-compliant with the diet and they were also experiencing depression, I would probably make very similar recommendations here in Baton Rouge as the counselor would have done in St. Louis or perhaps in Boston. So we really tried to utilize it to drive intervention fidelity, which was really important to us. And critically, the CTS was also very helpful because it provided the counselors, the intervention team, and study leaders and managers with real-time objective data or reports across the study and by site about intervention delivery. So we could click a few buttons, and every week we got a big series of reports from the CTS, and it would help us identify if a certain site needed more support in terms of, say, addressing dietary non-adherence, or if a site or a coach at a certain site really needs more guidance and support to help them get their participants to track their diet on a more regular basis, or to stop using pen and paper records and switch to the PDA so they can improve dietary compliance and so forth. So it was a really good tool for us. And importantly, one of the most critical features in the CTS for at least me and I think the broader intervention team is that the CTS could automatically determine if a participant was adherent to key parts of the intervention. First and foremost was the CR prescription. So every participant was given a specific calorie target, and we had to identify a way where we could actually determine whether or not they were following that energy intake target. We know that using food records, excuse me, we know that using food records is simply inadequate because they're not precise enough to determine whether or not they're following their diet. And it's really hard for people to use a food record over 2 full years religiously. So what we did is we generated these weight loss nomograms or weight graphs, and we generated these with Carl Pieper. There's a paper published on this. Carl Pieper published this in 2011 or thereabouts. And we used data from Calorie Phase 1 to generate a prediction equation that would show how much weight a person should lose over time if they're adherent to their 25% CR diet. So in this case, this person would go from about 164 pounds down to about 138 pounds over a year if they follow their diet. We only had data for 12 months, so we built the model on 12 months data, and then we put them into weight maintenance for the second 12 months of the study. We actually use then, of course, kind of the error terms from the model, and we have upper and lower bounds that represent the 80th percentile and the 10th percentile. We then would have participants, or actually the participants and their counselors would track their body weight in relation to the zone, and as long as their body weight was in this zone, we would consider them adherent to their CR prescription. So this person, of course, this rarely happened, right? But this is a model citizen here. They had very good weight loss, and they were in the zone pretty much the whole time. And so this person, we would consider adherent to the calorie restriction prescription for the entire 2 years. Now, if their body weight went above the zone, it was an objective indicator that they were eating too much, and that we would then deploy a series of strategies to try to help them get back on track. If their body weight went below the zone, then we would, of course, worry that they were restricting their energy intake too much, and we would perhaps have them bump up their calorie intake a bit. So again, here what we're doing is we're using weight change as a proxy of energy intake to know whether or not they're hitting their calorie restriction target. And the CTS actually maintained these weight graphs, and it would alert the counselor where their participant was. So if this participant is in the zone, the counselor is seeing this on screen, and they're also getting feedback from the CTS showing that they're a course adherent. Hi, sorry, I think someone just joined. If you could go on mute, that'd be great, because we hear you. Thank you so much. Over there again. Could you go on mute, please? Okay, I'm going to try to talk over that music. So this was a very helpful strategy, and again, it was utilized every week or with every encounter that we had with participants. And importantly, again, the CTS tracked all of that data for us. Thank you. Now, the CTS also automatically determined if a participant was adherent to session attendance and self-monitoring. So we tried to have patients monitor their dietary intake through the entire project, and they, of course, were also supposed to come to all our sessions. The CTS really tracked that automatically so we could quantify adherence data and attendance data in real time, and then really troubleshoot very nimbly and try to get people back in, especially if it varied by site or by counselor. Now also, the CTS also assisted the counselors in determining if the following behaviors were interfering with adherence to the intervention. So we would actually evaluate if things like poor dietary knowledge, binge eating or emotional eating, or psychiatric or emotional problems were interfering with adherence to the intervention and the study. And if they were, then we had a pre-specified algorithm of different toolbox options, which were largely behavioral strategies or dietary strategies specifically meant to address these problems and help a person get back to being adherent, attending their sessions, and doing well. And these options were known as open or closed. Very briefly, open toolbox options were available to the coach and the participant really at all times, and they're low in intensity and generally affordable or free. So this would be like maybe increasing contact with the counselor, or trying a different way to modify or monitor their diet, maybe a different self-monitoring strategy for their diet or physical activity, whereas the closed toolbox options were more costly and more intense. So this included, say, trying a highly structured meal plan, using meal replacements, getting meal replacements or food provision from a center for a while, and they, of course, were a bit more costly. Now, here's a little schematic of how we identified the targets for intervention and how we evaluated whether or not it was working. So what you can see is that we followed a problem-solving approach where we would identify the problem. We would define it very carefully. We would then evaluate which open and or closed toolbox options we would deploy to try to address the problem. So we would select one or more options. We would implement them with the participants. It was time limited, so we usually deployed a strategy for about 2 weeks or so. Then we would evaluate, based on the objective data, whether or not it addressed the problem. If it did, we would go into behavioral maintenance, into a continuation of the strategy. If it didn't, we would reevaluate the problem, redefine the problem, go back through this process again until we got something that worked. This was a very good approach, really kept participants accountable, and it was systematic. Therefore, the way in which we deployed it here in Baton Rouge to solve a certain problem should have been similar to the way it would have been deployed elsewhere. So here we have a sample for poor dietary adherence, that is poor adherence to the CR prescription. And again, this would be an individual who is out of that weight zone. So here we have a number of open toolbox options. You can see it's CBT strategies, increased training on portion size estimation and calorie estimation skills. Those are open, pretty affordable options. Down here we have the closed toolbox options. You can see these are more intense and more costly, including using meal replacements, providing food by the center, and so forth. And then, of course, we go through the dissemination plan and evaluation process to determine if that strategy is working. So very, very helpful. And again, much of this data was recorded and stored in the CTS. And again, those data are now available to you in the data. Okay, let's talk about the CTS data specifically. So the CTS generated a ton of data, and I will call this data process data. You know, it wasn't collected with the rigor that is used to collect outcome data. but we still collected very good data. You know, the counselors did this each and every week when they saw the participants, and the CTS did a really good job of storing it, and Monju has extracted it, so it's really quite useful to clinical researchers. So again, if you go to the CALERIE website, you can actually go in and go to the CTS section, and we have a data dictionary there for the CTS data, and you can extract the data very easily in SAS format and ASCII format. And if I can do it, you can do it. It's super straightforward and very, very simple. And again, because the CALERIE website has also all of the other data from the trial, you can download most of that data as well. And that data can then be related to the CTS data through the unique identifier. Okay, so what we're going to do is to outline the data set. So the data sets, you basically, if you download the data, you're going to get 5 data sets. And these are the data included in each of the 5. So this stands for the CTS subject information. Here we have, you know, data set number 1. And what you can see, this is actually just a copy and paste from the provided data dictionary. So if you download the data dictionary, this is what you're going to see for this data set. And thanks to Monju and DCRI's great work and descriptors, you can generally figure out exactly what you're looking at in the data set. So this obviously has their BMI, their weight at baseline, height at baseline, whether or not they completed the intervention. We also note the site, like which site they were. It's a number. So, you know, I can't tell you, I actually don't know what the numbers are, but you can break down the data by site. You know, the sex of the subject, age, and then you have, like, say, the number of sessions they attended, both individual sessions and group sessions. I should say that the participants went through a very rigorous intensive lifestyle intervention, and they attended individual and group sessions throughout the entire 2-year period, with much more frequent sessions occurring in the first 6 to 9 months. Now, the second data set is the data from the individual sessions. So these are data from individual counseling sessions for each participant. So for the first 24 or so weeks, you have these data every week. Then it kind of fades off as infrequently as every 4 weeks, I believe, later on in the study, which is later on in year 2. So these data are great. It actually shows you whether or not the subject attended each session. It shows you what week it was and what the topic was of that week. Also, every time that the participants came in and did an individual session, they also completed computerized visual analog scale ratings. So they would sit down and rate their level of hunger, their level of satisfaction, fullness, prospective food consumption, thirst, and satisfaction with the amount of food that they've been consuming. So we have very rich visual analog scale really throughout the entire project or entire 2 years of the project. We also have weight, BMI, and weight loss. Weight loss is expressed in kgs and percent. Again, these data are pretty much every week through the first 9 months or so, and it gets a little less frequent thereafter. Importantly, the data set also shows you the upper and lower weights for the weight zone. It also has their weight change, and the CTS designates whether or not they were adherent, i.e. within the zone. And you can also look and see if they're above the zone, below the zone, or whatever. Also, whether or not they were considered compliant to dietary self-monitoring, number of days where they actually use self-monitoring to record dietary intake, mean calorie intake reported per day. Obviously, that's probably underestimates, but it is what it is. And there's toolbox data. So we have a marker whether or not a toolbox was triggered for 25% CR, attendance, self-monitoring. You can see all the reasons why you would trigger a toolbox option here. So these are really good data from the individual session. And here we also have data from the group sessions. Excuse me. So this data set is much smaller. But what you can see is that in the group session data set, you have the week of the group session and what the topic was that week, and also whether or not the individual participant was in attendance that week. Next, we have the self-reported energy intake data. So this is a slightly richer data set that outlines the self-reported intake data that is obtained from the self-report methods. And just to recap real quick, so all the participants were encouraged to record their food intake throughout the entire 2 years. using a personal digital assistant. Believe it or not, those were in vogue at the time. And they used the DietMate Pro software. Or they could use a different software like Calorie King or what have you. Or they could use pen and paper records. So point being, you know, we have decent self-report energy intake data throughout the 2 years, but it was generated using a variety of methods. So we did actually report whether or not it was electronic recording that past week or two, or if it was pen and paper. And here what you're seeing is the days with which you're capturing calorie intake data. So this could be a 1 week time, maybe 7 days, 9 days, 14 days, whatever it is. And then you have the average calorie intake per day, excuse me, and whether or not it was reported by the PDA. And we also had a marker for whether or not it was, each day was entered as complete. Okay, lastly, we have pretty good toolbox data. So you remember that the toolbox really drove intervention delivery. So it was really used to guide what we did with participants and when. And so you have really good individual data on toolbox usage. So if you, here again, this is a snapshot from the data dictionary. And so again, all the data is noted by subject, by site. And then we have whether or not a toolbox option was used, how long it was used for, if it was a primary strategy to try to address the problem, if the coach considered it successful, how much it cost for that toolbox strategy, whether it was open or closed, why we deployed it, et cetera, et cetera. So again, some of these variables are sparse because they relied on the counselor to, of course, type all this information in. But again, because we use the CTS, we actually tracked and would mark in the CTS when we deployed a toolbox strategy and what it was used for. So we had pretty good data on toolbox usage throughout the course of the trial. Okay, so thanks to NIA, Giovanna, Chanda, and team back at NIH. The CTS data are referenced in 2 calorie FOAs. So they're noted here. There's, I believe, oh, Giovanna, I think, is one an R1 and one's an R21, perhaps? Either way, if you go check out these FOAs, yes. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so one's R1, one's R21. But basically, there are these FOAs available for us to submit grants to that could rely on the CTS data. Also, hi, I think someone just joined and they're on music. Could you put it on mute, please? Thank you. Also, here's 2 additional FOAs that I wanted to include in here. And these are FOAs specific to other calorie data and the biospecimens to identify mechanisms for CR-induced effects in humans. So 2 really good opportunities there. And again, the CTS data is referenced in 2 of the FOAs. Okay, let's go back into the website very briefly, and then I want to open this up for questions. So again, here is the CALERIE website. You can get a lot of information about the study. You can get access to all the published manuscripts. You can see what has been published before. You can download data freely. You just got to register and download the data straight away. It's freely available. And you can also apply to actually analyze biospecimens, which we'll review here in a second. So here are database information from the website. Here's a list of some of the biorepository specimens. I have a slide on here just for your own information, but these are the biospecimens that have been stored. And you can also apply for samples and data analysis. So critically, a lot of the biospecimens are there for us to obviously analyze. And so you can apply to gain access to the biospecimens and to analyze them. And Kim, Giovanna, you're welcome to chime in here, but I believe that you have to submit an application. It is reviewed by an external sciences committee. There may even be funds available to help fund the analysis of those biospecimens. And you're then free to, of course, report those results. But also we ask that you then upload those results of those biospecimen analyses back into the database. You can also, of course, get the manual of procedures and the protocol from the website. And it's a very, very good resource and is there for you. And lastly, I want to give kudos to the Calorie Research Network. I don't know if Bill Krause is on the call, but he's been very helpful at setting all of this up, as has Kim Huffman been. I know Kim is on the call. and she's really leading the charge and helping keep us all in line and keep the Calorie Research Network up and running, because this network is indeed the framework and the infrastructure that is providing the support to make the CTS data and other calorie data available to you and to make this webinar available. So again, there are some specifics about what the research network does. Here's a little org chart. I mentioned earlier that, if you want to analyze biospecimens, you would submit an application through the website, and it will then be evaluated by an external science committee who would perhaps award you access to the biospecimens. All right, I would love to end there and try to answer any questions if anybody has any.
Welcome to the world of service.
Are there any questions by chance? Another thing that I'll say real quick is that remember that you can, of course, download the CTS data, but it's obviously most relevant to you to also download the other calorie data so you can relate it to, say, the primary outcomes and other outcomes from the calorie research.
Corby, I just want to thank you for doing that, especially with the distractions in the background. That was super helpful. I learned a lot, so I really appreciate it.
Anytime, and Kim, thank you for keeping all this up and running.
I'm not sure, is Giovanna still on? Giovanna, do you want to make any extra points? Nope, I don't see her still on, so.
Okay. So Kim, if you believe I missed anything about the Calorie Research Network, please by all means chime in. But I thought it'd be really important for the group to understand that there's this infrastructure there to provide support to people that really want to analyze these data.
Yeah, maybe the only thing I'll add is that this year we're having a workshop for people interested in using the CTS as well as the biorepository and the remainder of the data repository. It is full, but we have some working groups that we're developing, and certainly we could even entertain adding another working group that could be entirely focused on the CTS and perhaps include that in a workshop for an upcoming year. So just to kind of put that out there.
Great.
Okay. Another thing that I wanted to say, I was on mute, so I couldn't talk before, is that even if you don't have questions right now, but you develop later, you can contact either Duke or Corby, as he explained into the slides. And also, this webinar is being recorded and is going to be posted into the CALERIE website. So if you wanted to look later at it or point out to other persons, to other investigators who may be interested, you have these resources to look at.
Yep. And I will type my email address on screen right now.
Yes, that would be helpful.
It'd be better if I could type more efficiently, but there it is. Great. So Giovanna, I think that is all that I have. If there's no other questions, I guess we can close a bit early.
Yes. So that was a really great overview of what we have, what is available, and how to work with it. So thank you so much, Corby, for doing that.
You bet. Thank you. And you all have a good day and a good weekend.
You too. Bye to everybody.
Bye-bye.